Well, thank you so much for this invitation. It's a special occasion, and I'm delighted to be with you.
Excellent. We have a lot to discuss. We want to proceed into it. As always, we're at an important time right now. Things are both interesting and difficult at the same time, and we have a lot of important things we want to get into. Why don't we begin just talking about, I guess, where you are at, if we can put it that way, in your work right now, John, when it comes to both the revival of Gnosticism, but also the teachings of the telestai that we've talked about so many times in the past now.
Well, certainly. Good place to start. You know, Henrik, it is, I think, November 6th would be the 2006, the 6th year anniversary of the publication of Not in His Image. And so I've been reflecting a lot on where I've come in that time. I like to take a stand back and look at what I've accomplished, you know, to my own satisfaction, you know, as well as to get a sense of what I've been able to put into the global conversation, the great planetary conversation, which is really a conversation about human origins, the current crisis in human society, and the future of the human race. You know, this is the big conversation we're having. So I like to step back and think about how I've contributed to that. I'm happy and proud to know that I am recognized as someone who has uniquely contributed to the revival of the mysteries. I think I've written about the mysteries in ways that others have not yet, at least, been able to do. And, of course, Gnosticism, in the term that I use it, is not a dead religion of the ancient world, but actually a living science of gnosis, perhaps the most important of the life sciences that is possible in the world today. So I'm happy to have contributed to bringing gnosis back into action and to having restored, as you know, I restored the Sophianic vision story of the mysteries. No other scholar has done that. I'm happy to see over these last 6 years that the power of that story is reaching people in and of itself. The power of that sacred narrative lives in human imagination in a way nothing else does. And frankly, I think nothing else can, because it is a story about our source that comes from the source itself. So these are contributions I've made, and I'm looking now at where to go in the ultimate move with my contributions.
Right. Well, I would kind of want to ask as well how you would like to see this work develop in the future. What do you feel is the next step in this process, John? Because it's been a long path for you, and you've brought out a lot of new things. But at the same time, maybe there's a recognition that it's also it's not the general direction where the world right now is heading in. Not that there's any need for a majority here, but what is an important next step, do you think, in this process?
Well, I can answer that, Henrik, in a specific and a general sense. In a specific sense, the next step is already underway, and that is what I call the Gaia navigation experiment. We've agreed that we're going to dedicate the first part of our talk today to that, and perhaps also some part of the second hour. So we'll get into the specifics of that right away. In a general sense, what I consider to be the most significant and urgent and decisive event for humanity today is for some members of the human species to enter the role that was previously occupied by the telestai of the ancient mysteries. Now, you know that word telestai. You're pretty familiar with it, and you probably use it, don't you?
Sure.
In some occasions.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I just want to point out, the word archon is pretty current on the internet, wouldn't you say?
Well, more so than ever, I think. It's people are looking for that new dimension to the controlling factors as we're always trying to pin things down. And I think that this is pretty much more or less where things are heading right now, towards a deeper understanding, or at least a peripheral understanding of the archons, for sure.
Exactly. What a focus that is in the breakthrough for our species right now, and what a focus it is toward winning back the truth of who we are, who we really are, and turning this experiment, this divine experiment, as the Gnostics would call it, turning it back to its original intended purposes. You know, the word archon is a powerful word. I'm happy that I have been a person who contributed uniquely to introducing this word into the current discourse on the alternative media, and even, who knows, to some extent it might reach the mainstream. For those who have never heard the word before, I'm sure all of your listeners have heard it many times, but it always serves to make this reminder. The teachers of the mysteries told us who the archons were. They pointed to the existence of these entities, and they described it in a twofold manner. And it's really important to take this intel in the way that they gave it. That is to say, to take it in a dual mode. The first mode was, they indicated that the archons are cyborg-like or locust-like inorganic species inhabiting the solar system, which have a predatory action of mind parasites operating upon the human world. So they are ETs, but they are ETs that live within the confines of the solar system. And as you know, Hendrik, the Gnostic creation myth, if you want to call it that, the Sophianic vision story, tells us about the origin of these archons and describes a great deal about them. So thanks to the telestai, the teachers of the mysteries, we know this. But there is also a second aspect, and that is less concerned with the supernatural and extraterrestrial profile of the archons, and more concerned with what I might call the destructive self-programming mental pathology of our own species. While it is true that the archons do have an independent existence as an ET cyborg species, and they can be encountered in various forms, in reptilian, the embryonic form, as the flyers or mud shadows of Castaneda. They are abductors of souls by night. They are messengers of deception, as Jacques Vallée said. Mm-hmm. They are mind parasites. But at the same time, the archontic factor is something in our own minds as well. They couldn't prey upon us if we, as human beings, I'm going to correct that syntax a bit later, but as human beings did not have a predisposition to fool and dupe ourselves. You see that?
Yeah.
And one of the worst ways, not one of the worst, the absolute worst and supreme dupery that human beings perform on themselves is the dupery of the rulers or authorities. And so this is also the way that the illuminated Gnostic teachers, the telestai, profiled the archons. They said that human beings can become archontified by falling into the illusion of power that operates through rulers and authorities. So one of the translations for the word archon is rulers and authorities. And the great breakthrough that we have to make in life on earth today, so that we can have a future worth living in a humane world, an equitable world, is to overcome the illusion of authority in all its dimensions. So this is a powerful course and a powerful challenge. And those of you who hear my words and recognize the ineluctable truth, well, give a nod of gratitude to the telestai. You know, it's interesting, Henrik, that the word archon has gotten around so much. The word telestai, a little bit, less so. Mm-hmm. But hold on a minute, it's the telestai who showed us who the archons are. So wouldn't it be as important to understand the word telestai as it is to understand the word archon? You see?
Sure. I think there is a natural tendency as well, for reasons I think we'll get into a little bit later, that we put a primary focus on the boogeyman, on the negative, on the dark side, right?
Yes, we do. It's also part of that dupery. Not only can we dupe and fool ourselves, but we can also scare the living bejesus out of ourselves. And there's a peculiarity about the human species that we actually like to do that. We like to scare ourselves. You know, there's an interesting phenomenon that I've investigated because it relates very closely to the awakening of the wisdom goddess Sophia. This awakening of the wisdom goddess, which is now erupting into a full-blown event, both psychically and geologically and atmospherically. This event historically began around the mid-1700s. And it's interesting to note that at the same time, this is just a little anecdote you might find interesting, at the same time that the divine Sophia, who is the immanent presence of our planet, began to awaken, she began to awake in what I call a lucid dream, the way that we awake in a lucid dream. And she found herself in a nightmare. Her dream is a nightmare. We call that nightmare human history of the last 300 or so years. And it's really interesting to note that the genre of horror, of writing horror novels, Gothic fiction as it was originally called, began at exactly that time. And it has accelerated massively to this time. So whatever else you might say for the plight of humanity today, one thing we have to look at, I think with some amusement and perhaps with some compassion, is our tendency to scare ourselves and dupe ourselves. Mm. Now, those tendencies could be used in a playful way. For instance, you dupe yourself when you go to the theater, don't you?
Sure, yeah.
When you sit and watch a play, one of the romantics, I think it was Coleridge, called it what? Voluntary suspension of disbelief or something like that. Forget the exact phrase. When you go to watch a movie or you go to the theater, you dupe yourself into watching this play being acted because of the pleasure and the edification that you can get out of it. So that it is not necessarily a negative tendency to be able to fool ourselves or to pretend, nor is it necessarily a negative tendency to want to scare ourselves. All children have that tendency. They love to scare themselves, don't they? Sit around the campfire at night and tell spooky stories. Mm. It's just when these capacities get out of control and when they go take a psychotic turn and when they become accessory to the working of the archons into our minds that they become extremely dangerous. And so what I'm teaching is a way to counteract those tendencies, to realize the imaginative power that has been endowed in our species, and to use it as the primary tool for the liberation of humanity from the archons, mind parasites, and from the authorities, or those who call themselves the authorities, running around this planet, wreaking havoc, murder, and mayhem.
Explain a little bit more on that, John, if you can, and let's detail that and exactly what you mean about how that could be accomplished.
Okay, well, this will lead into the Gaian navigation experiment. If we're to look at that proposition in a sober way, keeping our wits about us, realize that this is a big deal I'm talking about here. It's what is called, in the terms of the telestai or the shamans of the mysteries, an orchestration of fate. I'm involved now, since my book came out, and for some years now, through my own shamanic investigations, I'm involved in an orchestration of fate. And this orchestration of fate is nothing less than the fate of the entire human species. Now, how do you orchestrate the fate of the entire human species? if I might ask a rhetorical question. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, my friend, you do it playfully and very, very carefully and meticulously. But I would add, above all else, that you cannot do it alone, that this orchestration of fate, which is a way of shifting the entire scenario of history unfolding on this planet toward a beautiful conclusion, that way is only possible in collaboration with the planetary animal mother herself. You remember her, right?
Sure.
Pam.
Yeah.
You like the term Pam, don't you? It's user-friendly, isn't it, Henrik?
That's right, yeah.
Pam, P-A-M, the planetary animal mother. This is my friendly way and playful way to talk about the divine Sophia, who was the supreme goddess of the pagan mysteries and the supreme source of wisdom of those teleste. You know, the word teleste is a plural in Greek. The single word is telestes, T-E-L-E-S-T-E-S. So you are a telestes, I am a telestes. On what conditions? The condition is very simple. Telestes means one who is aimed, because it comes from the Greek root telos, meaning aim, objective, purpose, ultimate goal. So you can honestly say, I am a telestes, because I am one who is aimed. The question is, what aims you? You're like an arrow in a bow held by the archer. What aims you? Well, what aims the human being in this way, which is a mystical and magical and moral aiming, is the sighting power of the goddess herself. Hers is the sighting power of the archer. She is the archer who aims us. So it's impossible to orchestrate the fate of the human species if you don't do it in the framework of her story with her guidance and her direct instruction. So that is the foundation, as you well know, I think, Henrik, and many of your listeners now who've heard me talk will know this. That is the foundation of the ancient mystery schools. I wrote in Not in His Image, and I have the book right here, Inside the Mysteries. I explained that the common method of all the mystery schools was the divine mathesis, that is to say, instruction by the light. And for instance, you find a passage from Nag Hammadi, the tripartite tractate, which is the longest Nag Hammadi tractate, and it says, quote, "The originator instructed those who searched for higher seeing by means of the luminosity of that immaculate light," end quote. So it must be recognized today, if some of us are going to take up this challenge and step into the role of the telestai, those who are aimed, that one of the requirements for this is to stand in the presence of the organic light and to receive instruction by the light, as they did. Without that, even to hint or suggest some kind of orchestration of human fate would be ridiculous arrogance and folly.
Orchestration, John, just define that a little bit more for us. So we're talking about to make something, and is that with the aid of our imagination, of heading there before it's already has happened, or how would you define orchestration in this context?
I would define it by a cinematic analogy. You could say that the team of people who collaborate in making a film would be great, wouldn't it? I mean, it takes a lot of people to make a film. You've made a few yourself. Imagine making a full-length movie.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
I wouldn't even name the numbers of people that you need involved, all the way from the gaffers, who are the ones who have the keys to the boxes where the props are kept, to the light people, to the script people, to the director, to the actors, the makeup, everything. That's an orchestration. It's a vast orchestration Call it a collaboration if you prefer that word. And this collaboration, however, depends on all of the collaborators operating in the same framework. They have to know they're making the same movie.
Yeah, indeed. That's the aim right there, the goal of heading towards a general same direction.
Yes, I would call it a unitary vision that one reaches. Now, this unitary vision comes from the divine Sophia herself, and it comes out of her story. I've pointed out before that in order to understand the telestai, those who are the founders and teachers in the ancient mysteries, and who expose to us who the archons are, in order to understand them and their curriculum, it's very simple. You just think about them teaching the 3 S's. They taught the 3 S's. That is, source, story, and setting. And what they taught was that all these 3 S's are the same. So they taught a unitary vision of the divine Sophia, this wisdom goddess. They taught that she is the source of the human genome and the source of the experiment on our planet. She preconceived, planned, and engineered the experiment taking place on this planet. We are in an experiment. And the problem, Henrik, the real problem that we're getting to the bottom of now, and I know how much effort you have put into getting to the bottom of this problem. It's not easy. The real problem is that we're in a divine experiment on this planet, which is a laboratory for human experience. And we don't know what that experiment is.
Yeah.
Now, I ask you, how can you correct something if you don't know how it works? If you and I get a pile in a car and we decide we're going to drive to Oslo, and the car breaks down, well, we can fix the car and continue our journey if we know how the motor works.
Yeah.
Also, if we have a map to get to Oslo and we know where we're going, and we get off the road, we can correct that mistake and get back on track. We have not yet. This is perhaps one of the 2 or 3 important takeaways I want to say in this talk. We have not yet arrived at the point where we understand the divine experiment with humanity on this planet well enough to know how to correct it. But we are very, very close. That is my view.
Mm-hmm.
So the Gnostics introduced this divine experiment. They said that the Aeon Sophia is a goddess-like being, not to be seen anthropomorphically, but to be perceived as a massive torrent of light and energy, a massive plasmatic torrent in the galactic center. She belonged to a company of divine beings called the Aeons, or generators. They live in the center of all these galaxies. And at the center of our galaxy, there is a company of Aeons, a group of Aeons. And among them was one called Sophia, whose name means wisdom. And as the story goes, the sacred narrative of the mysteries, this divine wisdom goddess conceived of an experiment. First of all, she and another Aeon called Thelete actually designed and engineered the human genome. So the Gnostic sacred story tells you that the human genome originated in the core of the galaxy in which the solar system is located. It is a story about our galaxy. And so that's the source. The source of humanity is in the galactic center and in the mind of the divine Sophia. And in coupling with this other Aeon, Thelete, she engineered this germ plasm, which is what Aeons do. They engineer animated organic plasms, and then they seed them in the galactic arms, which are spiraling. There are 4 or 5 galactic arms in a pinwheel layout, spiraling around the core. And they seed this germplasm of these divinely conceived species into the arms. And then, because planetary worlds, Earth-like worlds, and other kinds of of planetary systems are continually arising and dissolving in the planetary arms by that method known as directed panspermia. This germ plasm floats on currents through the galaxy, and it embeds itself in various planetary habitats, just in the way that a fertilized ovum will embed itself in the wall of the uterus. And that analogy of the ovum and the uterus has been often used in ancient cosmology, as you know, to describe the seeding of worlds with animate life. So we're one example of that, but we're a very special example because the story says that due to an anomaly, and even among the gods there are events that happen by accident, that happen by chance. There is even novelty in the realm of the gods. In fact, there is immense novelty. And due to a novelty in the realm of the gods, this aeonic power from the center of our galaxy actually plunged out of her normal habitat, her habitat, and she descended, as it were, as a plume of massive plasmatic luminosity into the galactic limbs. This is called the fall of the wisdom goddess, mythological terms. And as a consequence of this fall, which is all described in the myth I have recovered, she herself metamorphosed into this planet we inhabit. Now, that was not intended in her original conception of our species. Do you get that difference? Do you get that nuance?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. That was an unintended event. What she intended was for the normal course of affairs. What's the normal course of affairs with aeons, with those artistic, scientific, God engineers, divine engineers in the galactic center? It is to engineer these various plasms, but then just allow them to evolve on their own terms, to allow these experiments or to arise in different worlds, and they can watch them. And they're really interesting to watch from the point of view of the aeons, because they don't know how they're going to come out. And because they allow them to unfold on their own terms. So it is not normally in the method of the aeons, if you want to use that term, for one of them to embody itself into the habitat or laboratory where the preconceived experiment will take place. I mean, try to get your mind around this proposition. I mean, this is like, wow. I mean, nobody else that I know of but the Gnostics have given us this scenario. So I have, as you know, developed and pursued this scenario. I've told this story. I started out with what I called FGS 1.0, Henrik. That was the Fallen Goddess Scenario 1.0. That is to say, based on the surviving fragmentary materials in Coptic and Greek, I reconstructed this sacred narrative, the story of Sophia, which describes the setting, the source of our existence and the setting of our existence. She was both at the source, and she is now the setting. She is the setting where the very experiment she conceived is unfolding. This is remarkable. So I've developed this as a unique exercise for human imagination. I don't present it as a belief system. I'm not asking anyone to buy it like another creation myth, just another creation myth, because it's not. I've said this before, and it's worth repeating. I'm a comparative mythologist who has devoted my life to an overview of hundreds of creation myths from cultures all around the world in different ages. And I can assure you that this story is unique, paramount, and singular, and there is nothing that compares to it. It is the only complete and coherent story we have of who we are, where we originated from, and what we are facing today. Now, we come to the place where the rubber hits the road. This is the place where those of you who like that story, or may even love that story, those of you who feel attracted to it, who sense its originality and its beauty, may wonder how you can actually be involved in that story as an individual person. And there is a way to be involved in that story, unlike any other myth. The reason for that, as you know, is because the Gnostics left it open-ended. It's an open-ended myth. In other words, it doesn't have a pre-written conclusion. You understand that, I think.
Sure. Yeah. I don't want to jump ahead and go to the ending already, but what that means is that since the ending isn't pre-written, this is for us up to imagined or create even better, right? And it depends on here if this is a play, if this is an experiment that we alluded to before. Maybe there is something to the fact that we need to imagine it first before it can actually play out and happen in the real world, John.
You've got it. First of all, there are two steps. First of all, of course, you have to know the story. You have to read the story, learn the story. You learn the myth. You don't just hear this myth like you hear the myth of biblical creation or some myth from some South American native tales or the Navajo creation myth or whatever. You don't just sit there and passively listen to this myth as it's being told to you as elders would tell stories to children. No. There's a responsibility. You learn this myth if it attracts you. And then I think the syntax would be how to imagine it further, how to imagine its development, and how to engage yourself in its development. Now, the key to that process was given in one single word in the whole Nag Hammadi writings. And this word is called diorthosis. That is the Greek word, diorthosis. diorthosis. Now that is a Greek word, a made-up word, found only a few times in the Nag Hammadi writings. But the meaning of that word is absolutely momentous. What the Gnostics said, and I'm going back now, remember the three S's, the source, galactic center, the setting of the divine experiment, planet Earth. Now the story says that when Sophia found that she had been pulled into planetary evolution herself, which is not the normal course of events for an aeon, there were massive consequences of this event for her consciousness as a divine being, as a divine supernatural cosmic awareness. There were massive consequences. And one of them was that she became, as it were, cut off from the company of those other gods in the Pleroma center of the galaxy. Mm-hmm. She lost contact with home base. And there are other factors. I won't go into all the lurid details, but it's fantastic to study what came about. First of all, she had to deal with these archons appearing, which is, again, another unanticipated side effect of her so-called plunge. She had to deal with these archons, which are like pesky locusts, cockroaches running around, causing a lot of trouble, thinking that they are divine beings themselves, and looking for some live entities to prey on. So she had to deal with the archons, so she allowed them to construct the solar system. They are the engineers of the inorganic solar system. That is, the solar system we inhabit, exclusive of the sun, moon, and earth. The sun, moon, and earth, according to Gnostic cosmology, represent the trimorphic protonoia of Sophia. That means that they represent the original three-body system that she dreamed. She didn't dream she would be one of the bodies, but she did dream there would be a three-body system. That is an organic system, captured in an inorganic system of the other planets. And that system was created by she allowed the archons to create that as a kind of Disney World to occupy themselves because they were really annoying her, as they are annoying us.
I wanted to ask you that as well, because I've always looked for an incentive of why the archons, did this. And could it be because the scenario here was so different then that they, maybe for the first time, could at least attempt to capture or get control of one of these aeons because of this scenario of her being on Earth, being Earth, if you know what I mean? Is this why they set up the system?
Yeah, they have definite ambitions, and it's really interesting to look into the psychology, you might say, the psychology and motivation of these parasitical ET entities, you know. They have their proper place in the cosmos. It's okay with Sophia if they construct a celestially mechanical system that's not alive, but that has certain beauties to it because it is modeled on the pattern of the aeons. All this is in the Gnostic cosmological text. I'm not making any of this up. But she said, and the texts say this very clearly, and Sophia observed that Yaldabaoth, who is the overmind of the hive mentality of the archons, the reptilian overmind, is called Yaldabaoth. Yaldabaoth could not observe his proper boundaries. So this is a problem with the archons. It wouldn't be a problem if they just stayed in their own turf, but they don't, you see? Mm-hmm. And so there were other problems too. In fact, the symbiosis of life and the diversity of forms of life within the habitat of the Earth as it began to evolve was really too much for Sophia to handle. She had a lot on her plate, and she became, at a certain moment, overwhelmed by maintaining the symbiosis of this planet. So that's another factor. And ultimately, the result of her plunge into terrestrial embodiment, if you will, was that she ultimately arrived at a state which I described a number of years ago with the term autistic. And some listeners who've been following me for some time may realize that one of the first statements I made about Gaia Sophia, as I call the planetary animal mother, one of the first statements I made upon direct encounters with her, direct communication with her, starting about 10 years ago here in Spain, was that she is autistic. Gaia is autistic. And this autism is due to the fact that she has to concentrate so hard to maintain the vast diversity of the planet in which she is imminently indwelling, you see. And so that autism is also a problem, not only for the aeons who would like to reach her, but also for human beings. Because you know, it's well known, it's very difficult to get the attention of an autistic person, isn't it?
Sure, yeah.
And so getting her attention is a massive breakthrough that has happened in telepathic practice in the last 10 years. And I know how to get her attention, and I can show others how to do this. And that is part of planetary tantra. So back to the orchestration, and back to the point that you are taking our conversation here, Henrik, back to the Gaian navigation experiment. The story says that at a certain moment, Sophia would achieve her diorthosis, which has been translated as her correction. Now, this is a massive clue left to us by the illuminated shamans of the mysteries. The very planet itself, the very awareness of this planet, the living, animating animal mother that gives you life, every moment of your life, is undergoing her own shift of awakening, and they call this correction. And this correction is now current. When I started to study Gnosticism in my early 20s, and then about 10 or 15 years ago, when I restored and recovered the full narrative of Sophia, I never anticipated that I would actually be living in that moment to come. But I now know that I am living in that moment. We are living in the moment of Sophia's correction, which began on March 19th, 2011, and will continue intensely for 3 years. So we're a little bit through the halfway point of that correction. And what I introduced in the Gaian navigation experiment is a way that anyone who cares to do so can use their human faculties to engage in this process of correction. First of all, to be a witnesses to her. Imagine that. Just imagine to be witnesses to the supernatural power of this planet as she takes that power back into her own control, as she frees this planet from the capture of the archontic system, both in its external form of celestial mechanics and in its internal form of mind control. And just imagine being able to be with her when she gives us, human animals, access to her power, to her sacred power, and to her purposes and objectives. Only through knowing Gaia can we know the objectives of life on this planet. What is the purpose of this experiment? Why? Because it's her experiment. From the get-go, the moment is now, in these 3 years, when this can be known. And I set up the Gaian navigation experiment as an exercise to that end. So that really sums up what it is in a general sense and what its objective is.
Very good. Now, there's a mundane question, but why these 3 years? Where does this come from, John?
Okay. Over many, many years, I have observed the sky. You know, one of the roles of a Turton or a treasure finder in the traditional Tantric Buddhism is to be a sky diviner, someone who can read the celestial code. Now, that's been one of the great endeavors of my life. And so I can read events in the sky in a particular way. I can't go into the details of it because it's a complicated methodology, but I've demonstrated it time and time again in practical examples to the crew, I call them, that is to say the crew on the mothership who are doing the Gaian navigation experiment with me. So I'm going to say that I was watching an extremely delicate and rare mechanism of the Earth-Moon system. This is all absolutely concrete, Henrik. The way that I arrived at the proposition of these 3 years is absolutely concrete, okay? It's scientific. It's not speculation. It's not channeling. It's not some metaphysical fantasy that I'm proposing you get on board. No. I can prove to anyone the parameters of this. The basic mechanism that I had been observing since around the early 1970s was the barycenter mechanism of the Earth. Now, this is an astronomical reality. I'll just give it to you very, very cogently and very quickly. The Earth is planet. Let's just take the current model and let's just use it provisionally. Maybe as we go along, this model will morph and we won't use it anymore. But let's just take the current model that the Earth is a material planet, a globular body rotating around a sun. And rotating around the Earth is a satellite called the Moon. Now, the Moon has mass and the Earth has mass. And the Earth has about 80 times more mass than the Moon. Now, when two celestial bodies are locked in that kind of system, there is a common center of mass between the two bodies. And so the mass of the Earth and the mass of the Moon, which circulates around the Earth, have a common center of mass. That is called the barycenter. And the laws of physics say that it is displaced by a factor of 80 from the center of the heavier body. So that means that the barycenter is located 1/80th of the way from the Earth to the Moon, which actually places it inside the Earth. So there is inside the Earth a certain point of mass called the barycenter. And that is actually what the Earth and the Moon themselves mutually rotate around. You have that picture?
Yeah.
Now, there are two axes of the barycenter. They are called the apsides of the moon. That means that at one point, at one moment, the moon is more distant from the Earth. And at another moment, the moon is closer to the Earth. Those are called the apogee and perigee of the moon. Now, I'd been observing this system for a very long time, very, very closely. In fact, I consulted with scientists at JPL Laboratory in Pasadena when they had sent out the Voyager probe, the famous Voyager probe in the 70s, with that plaque by Carl Sagan on it, you know?
Yeah.
At the time they were working on that, I was talking to them about this. This was a matter of extreme interest to me because I sensed, but I couldn't define it why at the time, that there was something about this mechanism that was of a cosmic importance. And so I studied it for like 40 years, and I watched it very closely without knowing what I was watching for. You could say that I was looking for it to do something, you know? I was waiting for it to do something, but I didn't know what. Okay? Mm-hmm. Well, I detected that in March of 2011, the barycenter of the Earth, which actually circulates around within the material body of the Earth at a mean rate of about 720 miles an hour. It does have a rate. It actually moves. It momentarily exceeded the speed of sound. Now, it had been approaching that limit of exceeding the speed of sound and dropping back again below the speed of sound. It had been, I believe, chaotically fluctuating across the barrier of the speed of sound, this barycenter point. Now, so what? What does that mean? Well, you may recall that for some time preceding the year 2011, but then very much so in the spring of 2011, there were reports all around the world about strange sounds.
Definitely,
in the sky.
Definitely. We did a program about that and brought up some of the examples anyway. Yeah.
Wouldn't you say that this was quite a massive display of phenomena there, Henrik?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out if they were all real or if there were part of this that was fed into, as we know, the copycat effect. But definitely felt like a few of these were authentic, genuine. What do you think?
Well, I also looked very closely at the question of hoaxing. We have to, you know, hoaxing is the signature of the archons. That's why there's so much hoaxing going on in the world today at every level. Government, education, media, history, it's all a hoax. That is the indication that the archons have reached their extreme limit of their penetration into the human mind. But the Gnostic story of Sophia says explicitly that at the moment that the archons reach the consummation of their powers, that is to say, they create a world full of hoaxing and faking. At that very moment, humanity attains its power to overcome them, and its power is the power of imagination. And that moment is also the moment of her correction, because she achieves her correction along with the witnesses and possibly collaborators among the human species, because the human species are the special subject of her experiment. So just let me return. We're getting close to the end of the first hour here. Just let me return and round off if I can.
Sure.
You tell me if I'm doing a good job here. This answer to your question of how I knew it started then and how long it's going to last. I believe that some of those reports were hoaxes, and I believe that a good number of the YouTube clips and so forth were fakes, and that has been proven to be the case. Nevertheless, I do maintain that there are some sounds at that time, which reached a crescendo at that time, around the time of the Fukushima event, and which continue to occur, that are due to the fact that the velocity of the barycenter of the Earth-Moon system is fluctuating at the speed of sound, and therefore you're having sound booms, and this is what we're hearing. And these sound booms are actually the way that Sophia as a planet is signaling back to the pleroma center and reestablishing two-way communication with her home base. And I determined from my knowledge of the sky, as soon as I got this perception, As soon as I realized that I'd been watching this point for 40 years without knowing why, and suddenly I realized, wow, that's why I've been so keenly focusing on this point. Because in my subconscious, I somehow knew, I had a huge sense of expectation about the correction of Sophia, but I didn't know how it was going to happen or when. But my subconscious prompted me, on the basis of my long-time observation of the sky, to identify this moment. And further identification of what was happening in the sky at that moment, the study of the lunar apogee and perigee, the way they are moving in the current time and in the years ahead, the study of the movement of Jupiter out of its own perihelion, that is its point closest to the Earth, into conjunction with the lunar apogee, the dance of the lunar apogee and Jupiter, the position of Saturn along the lines of the perihelion or apsides of Jupiter. These factors, believe me, are very solid and concrete astronomical factors. And I can read them as indications of the awakening of the life and power of the planet itself. And this is what I've done. But I don't ask anybody to believe me, Henrik. You can look over my shoulder and follow the method I use, and then you can turn around and verify it based on your own observations. And this is the invitation that I've made in the Gaian navigation experiment.
Wanted to just read a little bit about the barycenter here. Says the barycenter, aka center of mass, aka center of gravity of the Earth-Moon system, is located within the Earth. Due to the Earth's rotation and the orbit of the Moon, the Earth-Moon barycenter is always on the move. It's always about 1,000 miles beneath the surface of the Earth, or about 3,000 miles out from the center of the Earth. And it goes on to say, as you probably know, the barycenter lies on a straight line drawn through the centers of both the Earth and the Moon.
That's right.
Proceeds here. This is one reason why some people do not agree that the Earth-Moon system is a binary or double planet system. They think that the barycenter should be outside both planets. However, every other satellite in the solar system shares a barycenter with their planet that is at the very near at the center of their planet. There is no other example where the barycenter lies so close to the surface, only 1/8 of Earth's diameter of about 8,000 miles, and there are other reasons to think of the Moon as a planet instead of a satellite. I guess that's some of the official. Is that pretty much aligned what you're saying, or have you more to add to that as well? This is changing. That's what you're saying, right?
Well, what I'm saying is that is the official line. That official line can be matched very closely to the Gnostic cosmology that I'm presenting. Now, the Gnostic cosmology I'm presenting is not my invention out of thin air, but it is an elaboration of the myth combined with astronomical science, like you just explained, and combined with what I detect in reading the sky, because I can read things in the sky as a shaman that astronomers cannot read, and yet they are verifiable geophysical events. So what I did when I proposed the Gaian navigation experiment in June of last year was I invited some people to come on deck with me. I called myself the navigator. I said, here, I'm going to show you how I navigate. I'm going to show you my methods and my tools for plotting the navigation of the mothership Earth through this period of correction. And you observe with me, and I'll tell you particular moments to observe. For instance, one of the first things I proposed to the crew was that there is a moment each month when the Moon is in its apogee or its perigee. You can actually observe these moments because, sometimes the Moon looks much larger than it does at other times. Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
Well, that's very simply because there is a point where the Moon approaches close to the Earth called its perigee, and another point where it ranges out further away called its apogee. And this mechanism of perigee-apogee is actually a part of the way that the mothership steers herself through interstellar space. And so I proposed to the crew that we observe these moments. And I gave them the timing of these moments, which you can look up on the internet if you want to. Apogee and perigee moments of the Moon each month. And they're different from the new moon and full moon. And I suggested to the crew, I indicated rather, that there are certain phenomena that we could expect to see or feel or sense or detect at those moments. For instance, Henrik, you said that the barycenter, science recognizes that the barycenter is within the material mass of the Earth, but it also functions like a piston. At some time, the barycenter is like a piston pushed toward the core of the Earth. That's when the moon is at its perigee, close to the Earth.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
But when the moon is at its apogee, the piston is drawn out. It's still within the material mass of the Earth, but do you see it has a kind of piston action?
Right, yeah.
I said, listen, folks, we can experience and observe this action. We can experience and observe not only in our own psyches, but in the weather, in the telluric behavior of the Earth, and in the atmospheric and geophysical functions of the Earth. We can observe these moments as they're happening. We don't just have to have a scientific abstract concept. We go beyond that, but only go beyond that when you engage your imagination in her story, because you need that framework of her story to handle this kind of information, as it were. It's not even information. To handle this kind of input into your own mind, you need to be firmly grounded in her story. You need to know what you're looking for and what you're seeing. So I set up the Gaia navigation experiment, and I gave a time frame of 3 years for reasons which are perhaps a little too complex to explain in this talk, that she would take 3 years to set the initial conditions of her correction from spring 2011 to spring 2014. And then correction would continue and be ongoing until the end of this kalpa, which is 2216 AD.
Mm-hmm.
So, although the initial conditions of correction are being set right now, correction itself, once it is established, will proceed for 200 years. And what are the consequences of this correction? What will it mean for human behavior on Earth, for society, for the way we live, for the way we treat each other? What will it mean for the healing of the atmosphere and the pollution that has been created by human ignorance? What will it mean in regard to the violence on this planet, which is totally out of control? This is something that can be seen and answered by direct participation in her correction process.
We are going to take a break here in a little bit, John. I want to squeeze in a few more things here before we wrap things up for the first hour. This is a journey, literally, as we've talked about before as well, that's ongoing then right now. Is this also a process that is slowly taking us out of the Kali Yuga, that the conditions on the planet, the relationships, the predatory relationships is changing as well, slowly, with this?
Yes, indeed. One way you can think of the correction of the divine Sophia is as a reset. It's a reset. She is resetting the experiment to get it back to what works for her purposes. And the way she will do this is the way that any scientist would. Now, I want to give you a time parameter here that everyone might contemplate. The long kalpa of precession of 25,920 years, one complete cycle of the precession of the equinoxes, is 1 day of eonic time. 1 day. When you factor that down, 108 days of human time is 1 second of her time. So what I'm proposing is that she resets her experiment in 10 seconds of her time, which is 3 years to human annals. And the consequence of that, Henrik, is twofold. Bear in mind that the word diorthosis means dual solution or divided solution. There are 2 solutions that Sophia achieves in her correction. One of them is with human participation, and one of them is without.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So she resets the experiment, and if you're in the reset with her, you go into the next kalpa as the next mutation of anthropos. If you're not in the experiment with her, you go out with the trash, which is what Kali Yuga is about, taking out the trash. Mm-hmm. Cleaning out the infected part of the experiment. So imagine that she set up an experiment in a lab at the midnight hour. And at 11 minutes to midnight, which is what it is now in the Kalpa, she goes in to look at her Petri dish, goes in to look at her experiment. And she sees that part of the experiment has become infected and has gone badly wrong. She cleans out and eliminates that part of the experiment. And she recalibrates the other living entities in the experiment, the other organic components. She recalibrates them in a mutated form to go into the next day of the experiment, to carry it forward into a future success. That is diathosis of the divine Sophia.
Earthquakes, changes in weather patterns, other anomalies, John, that we've detailed before with you on the program are both on the rise and heading into new territory. It seems every other month there's some new kind of record breaking in all kinds of, in all ways. It's not only heating, it's cooling in some areas. It's just weird anomalies. It's we have different lights in the sky, which is kind of unexplainable. It's all over the place right now, and this is part of this changing and adjustment, as you've been talking about, correct?
All this is evidence of the geophysical, telluric, and atmospheric events that she needs to go through, because she's a living organism. She's living through these storms, these events, these eruptions, in order to reset this experiment. And it's very hard. Nobody can get their mind around all these things or make sense of it all. You're fooling yourself if you think you can. But I'll tell you what I use that helps me a lot. I use one basic parameter to evaluate all these catastrophic Earth changes, and that is that the electromagnetic body of the Earth is like the electromagnetic body of a human being. You know, we are like more than 70% water. The brain is nothing but like a Kleenex, a wet Kleenex saturated with electrical chemical impulses, right?
Yeah.
And the body itself, the cells are all floating in water. We are electrified water, or in ionic terms, life is the electrified animation of colloids. We are a mass of electrified colloids. And just as the electromagnetic charges in your body could go through an entire reconfiguration, the electromagnetic field of the entire planet is going through a reconfiguration. There is no more any single and stable North Pole or South Pole, is there?
Yeah, it seems to be very difficult to pin down anyway, and it's increasingly so.
And many North and South Poles are popping up here and there all over the place temporarily. Why is this happening? Because as she awakens, the power of her divine awakening consciousness recharges and electrifies everything in her body. She is having a massive Kundalini experience. Pam. And we're on for the ride.
All right, John, let's take a break here at this point, and it's pretty good time. We've gone over the hour, which is fine. We're not really limited to that, but we don't want to keep you all evening here either, John. Not in His Image is the book, and metahistory.org is the website. I urge you all who haven't checked it out before to go and do so, of course, and follow more closely John's work. Do you have any plans of writing anything new? I mean, I could imagine at this particular time, of course, you just want to kind of be in tune with everything that's going on and to a certain extent enjoy the ride, I would guess. But have you thought about anything in terms of writing, John? Something more? Something else?
I haven't been writing much because I can't. It's too slow. And the intel I'm getting in a real-time mode is too massive for me to put down in writing. So I'm trying to get it out as much as I can with the spoken word, which I think is more intimate and direct and friendly, and also people can hear me, you know, and they can determine from how I sound to them if they like this and if it's trustworthy for them to proceed, which is easier and faster than the time it takes to evaluate a book like Not in His Image. The illusion of authority in all its dimensions. So this is a powerful course and a powerful challenge. And those of you who hear my words and recognize the ineluctable truth Well, give a nod of gratitude to the telestai. You know, it's interesting, Henrik, that the word archon has gotten around so much. The word telestai, a little bit, less so.
Mm-hmm.
But hold on a minute. It's the telestai who showed us who the archons are. So wouldn't it be as important to understand the word telestai as it is to understand the word archon? You see?
Sure. I think there is a natural tendency as well, for reasons I think we'll get into a little bit later, that we put a primary focus on the boogeyman, on the negative, on the dark side, right?
Yes, we do. It's also part of that dupery. Not only can we dupe and fool ourselves, but we can also scare the living bejesus out of ourselves. And there's a peculiarity about the human species that we actually like to do that. We like to scare ourselves. There's an interesting phenomenon that I've investigated because it relates very closely to the awakening of the wisdom goddess Sophia. This awakening of the wisdom goddess, which is now erupting into a full-blown event, both psychically and geologically and atmospherically. This event historically began around the mid-1700s. And it's interesting to note that at the same time, this is just a little anecdote you might find interesting, at the same time that the divine Sophia, who is the immanent presence of our planet, began to awaken, she began to awake in what I call a lucid dream, the way that we awake in a lucid dream. And she found herself in a nightmare. Her dream is a nightmare. We call that nightmare human history. Well, thank you so much for this invitation. It's a special occasion, and I'm delighted to be with you.
Excellent. We have a lot to discuss. We want to proceed into it. As always, we're at an important time right now. Things are both interesting and difficult at the same time, and we have a lot of important things we want to get into. Why don't we begin just talking about, I guess, where you are at, if we can put it that way, in your work right now, John, when it comes to both the revival of Gnosticism, but also the teachings of the telestai that we've talked about so many times in the past now.
Well, certainly, good place to start. Henrik, it is, I think, November 6th would be the 2006, the 6th year anniversary of the publication of Not in His Image. And so I've been reflecting a lot on where I've come in that time. I like to take a stand back and look at what I've accomplished, to my own satisfaction, as well as to get a sense of what I've been able to put into the global conversation, the great planetary conversation, which is really a conversation about human origins, the current crisis in human society, and the future of the human race. This is the big conversation we're having. So I like to step back and think about how I've contributed to that. I'm happy and proud to know that I am recognized as someone who has uniquely contributed to the revival of the mysteries. I think I've written about the mysteries in ways that others have not yet, at least, been able to do. And, of course, Gnosticism, in the term that I use it, is not a dead religion of the ancient world, but actually a living science of gnosis, perhaps the most important of the life sciences that is possible in the world today. So I'm happy to have contributed to bringing gnosis back into actual origin of these archons, and describes a great deal about them. So thanks to the telestai, the teachers of the mysteries, we know this. But there is also a second aspect, and that is less concerned with the supernatural and extraterrestrial profile of the archons, and more concerned with what I might call the destructive self-programming mental pathology of our own species. While it is true that the archons do have an independent existence as an ET cyborg species, and they can be encountered in various forms. In reptilian, the embryonic form, as the flyers or mud shadows of Castaneda. They are abductors of souls by night. They are messengers of deception, as Jacques Vallée said. Mm-hmm. They are mind parasites. But at the same time, the archontic factor is something in our own minds as well. They couldn't prey upon us if we as human beings, I'm going to correct that syntax a bit later, but as human beings did not have a predisposition to fool and dupe ourselves. You see that?
Yeah.
And one of the worst ways, not one of the worst, the absolute worst and supreme dupery that human beings perform on themselves is the dupery of the rulers or authorities. And so this is also the way that the illuminated Gnostic teachers, the Telestai, profiled the archons. They said that human beings can become archontified by falling into the illusion of power that operates through rulers and authorities. So one of the translations for the word archon is rulers and authorities. And the great breakthrough that we have to make in life on earth today so that we can have a future worth living in a humane world, an equitable world, is to overcome and to having restored, as you know, I restored the Sophianic vision story of the mysteries. No other scholar has done that. I'm happy to see over these last 6 years that the power of that story is reaching people in and of itself. The power of that sacred narrative lives in human imagination in a way nothing else does. And frankly, I think nothing else can, because it is a story about our source that comes from the source itself. So these are contributions I've made, and I'm looking now at where to go in the ultimate move with my contributions.
Right. Well, I would kind of want to ask as well how you would like to see this work develop in the future. What do you feel is the next step in this process, John? Because it's been a long path for you, and you've brought out a lot of new things. But at the same time, maybe there's a recognition that it's also it's not the general direction where the world right now is heading in. Not that there's any need for a majority here, but what is an important next step, do you think, in this process?
Well, I can answer that, Henrik, in a specific and a general sense. In a specific sense, the next step is already underway, and that is what I call the Gaia navigation experiment. We've agreed that we're going to dedicate the first part of our talk today to that, and perhaps also some part of the second hour. So we'll get into the specifics of that right away. In a general sense, what I consider to be the most significant and urgent and decisive event for humanity today is for some members of the human species to enter the role that was previously occupied by the Telestai of the ancient mysteries. Now, you know that word Telestai. You're pretty familiar with it, and you probably use it, don't you?
Sure.
In some occasions.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I just want to point out, the word archon is pretty current on the internet, wouldn't you say?
Well, more so than ever, I think. It's people are looking for that new dimension to the controlling factors, as we're always trying to pin things down. And I think that this is pretty much more or less where things are heading right now, towards a deeper understanding, or at least a peripheral understanding of the archons, for sure.
Exactly. What a focus that is in the breakthrough for our species right now, and what a focus it is toward winning back the truth of who we are, who we really are, and turning this experiment, this divine experiment, as the Gnostics would call it, turning it back to its original intended purposes. The word archon is a powerful word. I'm happy that I have been a person who contributed uniquely to introducing this word into the current discourse on the alternative media, and even, who knows, to some extent it might reach the mainstream. For those who have never heard the word before, probably I'm sure all of your listeners have heard it many times, but it always serves well to make this reminder. The teachers of the mysteries told us who the archons were. They pointed to the existence of these entities, and they described it in a twofold manner. And it's really important to take this intel in the way that they gave it. That is to say, to take it in a dual mode. The first mode was they indicated that the archons are cyborg-like or locust-like inorganic species inhabiting the solar system, which have a predatory action of mind parasites operating upon the human world. So they are ETs, but they are ETs that live within the confines of the solar system. And as you know, Hendrik, the Gnostic creation myth, if you want to call it that, the Sophianic vision story, tells us about the